Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the last in the autumn series of seminars from the David Hume Institute. My name is Ray Perman, and I'm director of the Institute. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, can I just point your attention to the bottom of the screen there? You get Christmas and New Year off, but then we kick off again in January and February with again, a repeat of something we did at the beginning of 2014, which is to ask the 5 party leaders of the political parties at Holyrood to come and speak to 5 seminars. At that time, of course, the referendum was taking up our interest. In January and February 2015, it will be, we'll have the announcement from the Smith Commission, although we won't, until the end of January, have the draft bill. And of course, the UK general election will be on us. So registrations for that open next week. Don't all rush at once, but we'll be delighted to see you all there. This evening, we have a very special occasion because it's the presidential lecture, and our president is Professor Anton Muscatelli, who I'm sure you all know is Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of Glasgow, but also a very distinguished economist. And his subject this evening is inequality, which is a theme that has run through our last 2 seminars with the presentation by Professor David Bell on work he'd done for the David Hume Institute on inequality in Scotland, and then last week our presentation from Professor Charlie Woods on the work which is being done on well-being in Scotland. I'll hand over to Anton in just a second, but then the discussion after that will be chaired by Professor Hector McQueen, who is the chairman of the David Hume Institute. So now, without further ado, I'll hand over to Anton Muscatelli. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ray, for that kind introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and privilege to be here to present a lecture, indeed to have been asked to become honorary president of the David Hume Institute. Now, if I can get my presentation up, I will... Here we are. It's a real privilege as well to have followed such distinguished previous presidents of the Institute, including fellow economists like Sir Alan Peacock and, of course, Nobel Prize winner George Stigler. I was just having a chat with Ray and Hector earlier, and it's a real pity, particularly sorry that Alan can't be with us this evening, because conversations with Alan were always inspiring, and they ranged from music to Italian art to economics. And conversations with Alan were never, ever dull. Alan, of course, sadly left us this August, but I know that he'll never be forgotten as a giant of economics in this country. At the outset, I also want to thank my co-author, who's Alfred Duncan. Alfred is a PhD student in Glasgow and who helped me on this lecture. And, of course, for him, alas for him, we share all the added value, but also all the errors contained therein. So inequality is much in the news, as Ray mentioned, and this lecture is an attempt to give you a flavour of the international evidence on trends in inequality. But we could also have called the lecture Inequality and Growth, because one of the most interesting aspects around the concern with inequality relates to the bidirectional link between inequality and economic growth. It's one of the recurring themes in this lecture, as you'll see. Partly it's because it's been identified as one of the major issues and in one of the major contributions to this debate in recent years by Thomas Piketty, who wrote a book which was published recently called Capital in the 21st Century. In fact, as I hope to demonstrate during the lecture, it's the fundamental forces underpinning growth, such as advances in technology, the formation of skills and human capital, that actually, in my view, offer the best insights into the forces driving inequality, including inherited wealth and the impact on social mobility. I'm also going to look at the importance of taxation and public goods in ameliorating inequality trends. And I think this is a really important point, because it's very easy to conclude that greater inequality can be addressed simply using income taxation, or as Piketty actually argues, wealth taxation. But in fact, the provision of public goods and the social milieu, what might loosely be called social capital, may be just as important. And finally, I'm going to conclude with the point that a lesson from all this economic analysis is that if society really does care about inequality, then alongside our normal economic metrics in a country's economic performance framework, it'd be perfectly natural to test public policies for their impact on inequality. In other words, just to assess how policies impact on the distribution of income and inequality, not just within any given generation, but across generations. Before looking at the evidence in earnest, given my affiliation with the University of Glasgow, I felt I should pay tribute to Adam Smith and make a serious point in passing. This is a well-used quote from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and it's often seen as making a point about inequality. In fact, I just want to demonstrate that it's actually quite dangerous to selectively quote economists to make political points. Because if you, in fact, if you don't just select that bit of the quote, if you go for the full quote, you in fact see that Adam Smith was not simply making a proto-Marxist point. Adam Smith was very much a man of his era, and if you expand the quote, you'll see that he analyzes the wages of labour and indeed develops his perspective on the labour theory of value. Adam Smith wasn't making a point about the unemployed, he wasn't making a point about the poor. He was talking in the Wealth of Nations about something which is just as important, as we'll see later on, the importance of market forces ensuring that workers should receive an appropriate reward for their contribution to the creation of value. And it's a key point in some of the things that we'll analyze in a moment. I also feel I should pay tribute to David Hume, and this quote didn't fit in one slide, so I've put it in two. And it wouldn't be a David Hume Institute lecture otherwise if I didn't pause briefly on David Hume as a good friend of Smith and his perspective on the issue of income distribution. And this opening part of the quotation is something we'll return to later when we look at the problems that economic inequality may cause to social cohesion and hence economic development. And this is the end of the quote from David Hume's essay of commerce. So it's worth recognizing at the outset that there are many dimensions and measures of inequality. I'm not going to focus on measurement issues in this lecture, and I'm going to focus largely on income inequality. Ray mentioned that David Hume Institute commissioned a study by David Bell and some co-authors, which is a really excellent study. I would commend it to you. It was published a month ago. It looks at a number of issues in relation to inequality in Scotland in particular. It looks at Scotland and the UK. And again, I'll refer you to that paper for that sort of detail which focuses on our own perspective in this country. What David and his co-authors also do is something which I don't have time to look at here, is important demographic issues such as the participation of women in the workforce and older people in the labour market. And as I say, I don't have time to look at this here. I'm going to show you a couple of charts on income inequality in some OECD countries. This first chart shows economic inequality across a range of OECD countries using a measure of inequality called the Gini Coefficient. The Gini index is a measure that varies from 0 to 1. Basically, 0 indicates complete equality. You would have a Gini index of 0 in a country if everybody had the same income. And it would move to 1 if there was complete inequality, which in a Gini index is if one person had all the income and everybody else had nothing. So obviously unlikely to happen in practice. So a higher Gini coefficient indicates greater inequality. And what this chart shows, there's a red bar for each, which is a market income. This is what the market would deliver in terms of inequality if there were no taxes and benefits acting. And then the blue bar, which shows that what happens after taxes and benefits and transfers take place. So the difference between the two shows the impact of if you like, of redistributive taxes and benefits in the economy. So a number of points can be seen from this. First, the inequality, and not something you can see from the chart, but I should point out that the degree of inequality across these sorts of countries, advanced industrialized countries, is actually less than in many developing and emerging economies. And I'm going to focus less on these. But if I had put a graph of all the developing countries and the advanced countries there, you would see the highest Gini numbers, the most inequality in Latin America, in Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa. You wouldn't see numbers, you would see numbers much bigger than these ones that I'm showing here. However, even if we focus on the OECD countries alone, you'll see that countries' tax and benefit systems in some cases make a big difference to inequality. So you have countries like Finland, like Denmark, like Norway, like Sweden, where actually if you were before taxes and benefits, actually have quite a lot of inequality, just as much inequality as countries like the US and the UK. They have benefit and tax systems that are much more equalizing than we are, much more redistributive. Unlike the ones in the UK and the US and Israel that are on the far left, which tend to redistribute less. And these are the ones where the blue bars, where the blue bars are highest are the ones that even after taxes and benefits, there is greatest inequality. Now, there's a correlation between the amount of redistribution that happens in each country through the tax and benefit system and the amount of inequality. And actually, it's not surprising that there is a positive correlation because most tax and benefit systems are progressive. So actually, the more inequality you start with, the more you should expect to see redistributed through a progressive tax system. But this graph is interesting because it shows for any given level of inequality, how much, whether the sort of redistribution that we have in that country is more or less than you would expect conditional with respect to that level of income inequality. So what you see is that, again, in countries like Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, they're above the line. And that shows you that they redistribute more than you would expect for their level of inequality. Finland, Germany, France. The UK is right on the line, which shows that actually in the UK, inequality is pretty much due to market outcomes. Actually, in terms of market outcomes, in the UK inequality, and it's not shown in the chart, but it's probably as big as it is in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal. But the tax system, the UK tax and benefit system, actually does redistribute quite a bit, although obviously still leaves the UK as one of the less equal societies in the OECD countries. And actually, again, I refer you to one bit of the David Bell study, which is very interesting, which shows that the growing inequality in the UK is largely driven by what has been happening in London and the southeast relative to the rest of the country. Excluding London, UK inequality, as measured by Gini indices at least, has been stable roughly since the early 1990s. Indeed, if I'd plotted Gini coefficients over time, instead of just for 1 year, the year I was showing was 2011, you would have seen that growing inequality is not a recent phenomenon. It's something which has been happening since the early 1980s. So I suppose one natural question to ask is, why is there such great interest in inequality at this time, given that it's not a new phenomenon? Well, in part, it's because the financial and economic crisis has had a very differential effect. It has compressed or reduced real incomes at the bottom end of the income distribution, whilst higher income seems to have been at least protected, but in some cases we actually have grown. And in fact, some of you will have seen the Economist article, I think it was last week or the week before, showing that it's not even the top 1%, actually it's the top 0.01% that have seen incomes that are rising very rapidly. In addition, I think at the very bottom end of the income distribution, we've seen increases in absolute poverty, which is another reason why I think we're much more concerned about inequality. And in part, the other reason why I think we are concerned with inequality is because prospective growth has been reduced. We feel that growth isn't something that we can take for granted in the world economy. And there are, as a result, I think people worry more about the distribution of income. But finally, I think there's another point which I will talk about quite a bit, which is that I think there are real concerns about the degree of social mobility. People would care a little less about inequality, I think, if there was the opportunity, equality of opportunity, but it clearly isn't, as we shall see from the data. Interestingly, the stories do vary a bit across countries. If one looks at the changes in market income, both market income and post-tax Gini coefficients and this plots changes between 1995 and 2010, we see that the stories are different in different countries. So in countries like the UK, we've seen an increase in inequality in terms of market outcomes, which is why we're quite close to the horizontal line. But actually, some of that has been redistributed because of the impact between 95 and 2010 in terms of taxes and benefits in the UK, particularly the introduction of things like tax credits in the UK. On the other hand, we see that, and I think this is interesting, we see that even in Sweden, Finland, countries that are redistributive, we see that actually they haven't had an increase in market income Gini coefficients, but they've had an increase in disposable income. So the inequality is growing also in Scandinavia and some of the Nordic countries as well. As I said earlier, I think some of the concerns are fueled by the growth in the share of national income accruing to the top 1% or the very top of earners. And this is a chart which plots that for a number of countries, not all the countries. This comes from a data set which has been put together by Tony Atkinson, by Thomas Piketty, and by Size in 2010. And this is a 10-year moving average, which shows that exactly this point, that we've seen an interesting turnaround in the fortunes of the very top earners and in the income distribution. We've seen, they saw a decline in their share of national income. Some of these numbers are pretty big, as you can see. I mean, in the United States, both at the beginning and the end of the sample, the top 1% gets just under 20% of national income, which is a huge number. But you see that there was a decline during the period between 1940 and 1980, and then an increase in most countries. But in countries like Sweden, that's been more moderate. In countries like France, it's been more moderate. But in countries like Canada, the UK, and US, we've seen a much bigger increase. And the divergence of the earnings distribution is the key theme, as I said at the beginning, of the book Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. Now, it's very difficult to do justice to a major work like that in a few minutes. I'm going to try and just summarize Piketty. It's a bit like summarizing Proust. So in a couple of slides. Now, I do apologize. There are equations in this, and I did struggle with this a bit when I said it's a public lecture that you don't put equations in it. I will explain them in words because I think it's important for you to understand what the key point is here. And it can be said in words, but for those who are economists in the audience, there you are. There's a couple of equations, just to make you feel happy. In essence, what Piketty is arguing in his book is that inequality is driven by capital income, where capital isn't equally owned across the population. It's only owned really by part of the population, what we might call a capitalist class. Now, those of you who are economists will know that the work of Nicholas Calder looked at exactly those sorts of models, workers and capitalists, and how income is shared between them. So it's that sort of tale. Now, the first equation is just a definition. It's saying that the share of capital, the share of capitalists in national income is defined by R, which is the real rate of interest, the amount that you earn on capital, multiplied by capital and as a share of national income. Now, economic growth models tell you something about the way in which the economy grows and how it grows over time and what it tends to go towards. That's called the equilibrium in most models, economic growth models. And most economic growth models will tell you that you should settle down the capital to output ratio, capital to GDP ratio, should settle down to a ratio which is the ratio between S, which is the savings rate, and G, which is the growth rate in the economy. Now, if you just substitute one into the other, this is one of the key points that Piketty makes, is that capital's share of income depends on the savings rate, the real rate of interest, and the growth rate. And Piketty's central argument is this. It says that if the savings rate and the real rate of interest won't change as much as the growth rate, what we've seen since 1980 is the growth rate falling, and therefore the capital share, and hence capitalist share in GDP grows. Now, if you think of it intuitively without the equations, he's simply saying this. Capitalists earn largely through the real rate of interest. That's what they earn on shares and on real capital. Workers really get their income from labor income. If the growth rate falls in labor income, whilst the real rate of interest is high, then actually capitalists will grow their share and workers will have less of a share. So actually, in words, you can say it much quicker than you can say it in three equations. So Piketty basically is arguing that generally we'll see that R is greater than G, and therefore inequality will tend to diverge. That's the key point. That's the key point that he's making. Now, again, what he's saying is that his take on history, it's a general sort of tale of history, is that the period between 1940 and 1980 was an anomaly in the world economy. And there's an inexorable tendency for inequality to increase over time. And so he basically is arguing that we are returning to a world, now that growth has slowed down, and the savings rate and the growth rate, the savings rate and real rate of interest is still high, we're returning to a situation where there's going to be growing inequality. And he argues that the only way you're going to tackle this tendency, although he admits it's a utopian idea, given the problems of taxing capital, because capital can be moved between countries quite much easier than other assets, is through a coordinated world tax on capital, on wealth. So if the world economies could come together and start taxing capitalists, then that's really the only way in which you're going to really tackle this in a serious way. Now, to save time, I've really simplified Piketty. I haven't done him justice, really. The book contains much richer arguments about divergent labor incomes as well. He talks about labor incomes diverging as well as capital income. But in essence, this is one of the key stories. And it's interesting because, and the reason it's appealed, I think, is because it tells an interesting story. It tells a really good story about how the landowner classes of the 19th century were then taken over, were then superseded by the factory-owning classes in the 19th century, and they topped the income distribution. And then we saw the period of the earlier 20th century with world wars that destroyed some of that capital. And since then, we've seen a class of supermanagers and a divergence of incomes between the poor, those who earn little, and those who actually earn much more. And that's the tale that he tells. Now, there are critiques of Piketty. I mean, there's one, and I'll just give you one example, one critique, because it's probably quite typical of many. There's a contribution by Darren Acemoglu and his co-author Robinson, who provide quite a comprehensive critique. They argue that perhaps Piketty tends to ignore institutions. Now, I think that's probably unfair. I mean, actually, Piketty does quite a lot of historical analysis. What Acemoglu and Robinson are getting to, however, is saying, look, what's important in understanding inequality is to understand how political and economic institutions evolve over time. They should be central to an analysis of inequality. And these institutions, in turn, depend on growth. So, for example, if we have a slowdown in growth, then inequality, and supposing inequality increases according to Piketty, then would that not then trigger a change in those institutions governing the distribution of income? Will that not have political consequences, which will then lead to a change? So shouldn't we analyze those? And these might lead to so-called rent-seeking behavior. Now, what economists mean by rent-seeking behavior is where different parts of the economy, workers, capitalists, if you like, if you want to use that analogy, are fighting over the share of the pie as opposed to the size of the pie itself. So I mean, what Acemoglu and Robinson are getting at is we should get to an understanding of how institutions also fit into this story. The other criticism, the second bullet point, is that in reality, unlike what Piketty argues, Piketty is wrong in arguing that the real rate of interest, that the savings rate, and that the growth rate are all independent of each other. They argue that actually the real rate of interest and the growth rate are linked through household and production technology. Now, to put this in lay language, in fact, you should see a linkage between these two variables over time as household behavior will actually link the real rate of interest and the growth rate. One important assumption that effectively Piketty makes is that there's a high degree of substitution between capital and labor. Now, that's not always the case, not in the short run. You know, you could choose to have more labor-intensive methods of production in a country as opposed to one of the reasons that you can get these results that Piketty has is because of an assumption about the elasticity of substitution. The other, however, much more seriously, the last two bullet points I think is much more serious for Piketty because what Acemoglu and Robinson shows is that even if the real rate of interest is bigger than the growth rate, actually Piketty's result may not hold if there's sufficient social mobility. If people who are relying on labor income can become capitalists. It only works if you actually segment those two classes. But if you have social mobility, actually, maybe that's not a problem. But I think the final point is probably the most devastating one for Piketty, and it's one that certainly, means that the evidence doesn't quite fit, in my view, that you should expect, therefore, if he's right, you should expect the difference between the real rate of interest and the growth rate to be somehow correlated to increasing inequality in different countries. Now, you don't see that. There is no evidence that the real rate of interest minus the rate of growth has some sort of correlation. I would add the following points, which I think also create some problems. Piketty makes this assumption that if growth slows down, then that should generate inequality. Now, that's a testable empirical proposition. And I think there's alternative models which point exactly the other way, as I'll mention in a moment. Also, the growing share of capital in GDP may have less to do with asset classes such as, may have more to do with asset classes such as housing wealth. I think one of the reasons we see inequality, and which fits more with alternative stories, is that housing wealth is becoming very unevenly spread. We're seeing house prices rising in parts of different OECD economies much faster than in others. And it's housing wealth that's driving a lot of inequality. And it's less of a part of Piketty's story. But I think the last 2 points are important. I tend not to like models that focus on general laws. Maybe I was turned off Marx when I read it as an undergraduate. But I think if you focus on general laws, then I think you miss the fundamental forces that are driving the income distribution. I think we should be much more interested in what's happening, what's the structural explanation for all this, what's happening underneath there. The role of institutions, that, as I mentioned a moment ago, technology, human capital, international trade, social behavior. And I think if you focus on the fundamentals, then I think you have more of a chance to look at the policy prescriptions that might solve this without having to resort to utopian global wealth taxes, which I don't suspect will work in practice. So as an alternative to the grand theory of Piketty, I think there's much more value to be had in really understanding the fundamentals of what might drive inequality. And I'm going to focus on 4 broad types of explanation that's there in the economics literature. One is that inequality is basically the result of a race between education and technology. The second, that it might be due to what might be called scalable tasks and superstars. The third, that it's international trade and globalization that's at fault. And the fourth is that it's to do with changes in bargaining power and the power of different interest groups, unions, firms, and businesses. The first 2 of these bullet points, the first 2 explanations focus on human capital formation, on education, on skills as explanatory factors. The third asks, as I say, if a more integrated world economy can explain this. And I'm going to focus mainly on those first 2 explanations because I think they tell us more of the story. I think international trade and globalization has a role, but it's one that complements the first 2 explanations. And I think the 4th explanation may have something to do with it, but it can't explain why inequality is continuously increasing. It might explain something about the 1980s, but I think it's less of an explanation for the long run. So I'm going to focus on the first. Let me turn to the first, because I think this is a thesis that was developed by 2 American economists, Claudia Goldin and Lawrence Katz. And they highlight the importance of the varying supply of human capital in the face of technological change. And their insights actually go back to the work of a Dutch economist called Jan Tinbergen. I think he might have been one of the first Nobel Prize winners in economics. And their thesis is based on the following points. First, they argue human capital, education, skills is a key determinant of economic growth. Second, however, technological progress, as we've observed it in the last century or more, is skills biased. That is, as technology evolves, it requires higher level skills. So, for example, routine tasks in manufacturing and services can be automated, and as a result, individuals who've accumulated human capital through education, higher level skills, are better placed than ones that don't have skills, that therefore used to rely on jobs that involved skills that have been superseded by technology. Third, investments in human capital through education should help to moderate inequality. So, this thesis says if you observe that we're investing more in education, you should see that reducing inequality. Conversely, if the growth in education, participation, and expenditure decreases, then we should see, with a steady pace of technological change, we should see an increase in inequality. And their work is largely based around the USA. Their thesis is largely based around some evidence from the USA. And they call the 20th century, in fact, the human capital century, and they argue that the USA had a relative leadership in universal education in the 20th century, a position that then gradually lost over time towards the end of that century, and now it's been superseded. Now, the implications, actually interesting, because the first is that faster growth actually results in more inequality in this model. If that technological change and growth is not matched by human capital investment. So there's a policy prescription right away for governments. Second, returns to education should increase when inequality rises. You should see a match between the two. So if you're a graduate relative to a non-graduate, you should see that differential rising with inequality. And third, an implication of this story is that, third, as you know, one of the things that they observe is that in the middle of the 20th century, income inequality in the United States fell, and they explain that because of school reforms in which increased publicly funded primary and secondary provision to all citizens in the US, regardless of income, regardless of gender, and indeed, actually, even in most states across racial barriers. In contrast, in Europe, school access was not freely provided to low-income children, and inequality remained high. Now, in recent years, of course, we've seen, since the Second World War, we've seen, of course, the rest of the OECD countries closing the gap to the United States in terms of education provision, and therefore that explains why we've seen the United States inequality rising relative to Europe. Now, here's some of the data which they present, which actually justifies this. I must say, when I first saw this back when I read Golding and Katz, I found this quite striking because I didn't realize there was just such a difference in education participation. This shows British schooling attendance at 14, at 17, and indeed 15 to 18-year-olds as a percentage of the total of the total population, of the total school roll, potential school roll, and in contrast for the United States between the years of 1870 and 1960. And you can see just how rapidly in the 1930s and then in the 30s educational participation rose in the States to levels of certainly up to 17 of 67.7%, with high school graduates of 45.6%. At the same time, certainly in British schooling was lagging behind. But also look at this chart, which shows even in 1955-56, where looking at the involvement in education at both in terms of full-time general and full-time technical, in terms of full-time secondary school enrollment rates between the ages of 15 and 19, where, again, in most countries, you had compulsory schooling, and then after that, very few people continued into either higher secondary or indeed tertiary education. The USA was far ahead of everybody else in Europe. So the question, I suppose, is does the Golding and Katz theory fit the evidence? And yes, I think the model explains why we saw an increase in inequality in the USA from the late 1970s, because, as I said, the growth in supply of higher education and college graduates in the US has slowed down. In fact, if you look now after the introduction of much higher fees in US and universities, you're finding that actually participation in college is going down. So we should expect to see even higher, even greater increases in inequality. Now, the one thing that the model can't explain, the one thing that Golding and Katz can't explain, is why for lower skilled workers, their real wages are actually falling now. And so it doesn't quite fit the evidence, because what you should observe is that you've got high skills, you should do better and better and better. It can't explain why actually people who have lower skills, their wages should actually be falling. There must be something else happening there. But certainly, the higher education or college premium seems to be more, and indeed seems to be more driven since the 1990s by what was happening to the wages of less skilled workers. So the last 2 points suggest that you need to refine the model a bit, but there's no doubt, I think, that there's some evidence that there's something happening here. Just this chart shows one implication of the Golding Katz model, which says that if a country invests more public expenditure in university and college education for tertiary students, you should observe less inequality, and therefore the gap between college and university graduates and high school leavers the gap between their earnings should shrink. And in fact, you do observe that. There's an inverse correlation. Those countries where the state invests less, you actually have higher graduate premium. So I think the question is whether the Golden Cats model can be made to fit the data much better. I think you can. Actually, one way in which you can do that is by introducing some refinements to the model. Instead of focusing just on low and high skills, you can talk about tasks. Tasks being, you can think of jobs as tasks. And that there might be, tasks might then be, jobs might be fulfilled by having different groups of high and low and medium skilled workers. And if you do that, then actually you can explain the data much better in terms of inequality. The model also gets better if you start allowing for things like directed technological change, so that firms can actually direct technological change at times when they innovate, and where that responds to the supply of skilled labor. And that is actually should exacerbate inequality, because if you have a high-skilled economy, those high-skilled workers might be able to direct technology towards even higher skills, thus actually creating more inequality. So one example of directed technological change is the increase in innovation in IT equipment and software. If you've invested, if you have companies relying a lot on high-skilled individuals, that could even drive technological change even more. And actually, you can introduce a spatial element, which is quite interesting in these sorts of models. And if high-skilled workers rely more on their networks to be more productive or to search for work, then these so-called network externalities, if you expect them to be greater amongst highly skilled workers, then actually they can exacerbate inequality, because what you might find is you might find agglomeration effects. So high-earning, highly skilled workers like to be located together in fast-growing cities, and then you get reinforcing effects through the housing market, and then you have rising house prices, and that could create agglomeration effects around large cities. And again, that sounds very familiar when you look at economies like the UK, where highly paid jobs tend to congregate in particular areas as well. Now, I want to say something about scalable tasks and superstars quite quickly, because of course it fits actually quite well with the whole Golden Cats story. Because of course we've said many of the recent increases reflect earnings in inequality, reflect increases in earnings at the upper tail of the income distribution. In the UK, as David Bell and his co-authors showed, to some extent it's due to the financial sector, but we see that in other countries as well. And that presents, as I say, a challenge to explanations like Golden Cats, which say it's all about education and the race between education and technology, and indeed globalization, which I'll turn to in a moment. But I think you can actually add the scalable tasks element to the Golden Cats story, which I think can explain what is happening at the very top of the distribution. One explanation for increases in pay within the upper tail of the income distribution is, as I say, the importance of scalable tasks. So, and what do we mean by scalable tasks? Well, let me give you a little analogy, which is based on the analogy of singers and entertainers. So before recording technology became part of the world, basically entertainment was locally provided to a local audience. So earnings were limited by the limited audience in each place where you might find an entertainer. So if you're a singer in Dresden, if you're a fantastic singer in Dresden, you weren't competing with a singer in Paris. You had your own market, you had your own earnings. If you start introducing recorded music into that world, and recorded music that's widely available, then actually the two are competing with each other. Place becomes less relevant. And so one singer could capture the whole market if they're better than the other. Now, that's a scalable model. And some modern business models are inherently scalable. Google, Facebook, Amazon are examples of scalable models, are examples of companies that have found a very scalable business model. You don't want to be on Facebook if there's an even better social media outlet out there. And once all your friends are on the other social media platform, everybody moves to that. These are not standard competitive models where 2 or 3 can compete equally. You can have very unstable equilibria in that sort of model where winner takes all. It's more like a tournament model. And so what you find is that you can get one clear winner, one clear company, accruing significant earnings. And the same applies to those individuals. So let me turn now to trade and globalization as an explanatory factor. By itself, actually, standard trade theory, which is based on comparative advantage, can't explain increasing inequality, because one of the really interesting things about inequality, and if I'd shown you data from India or from other emerging economies, you would have seen that inequality has increased not only in industrialized economies, it's also increased in developing or emerging economies. So why is it happening in both places? Because if it was simply low-skilled wages being compressed because we were importing cheap imports from these other countries, you should actually observe inequality perhaps increasing here, but actually you shouldn't observe that in emerging economies. Instead, if you combine the trade and globalization story with the golden and cat story, you can actually explain why you might end up with inequality rising all over the place. So, for example, you could, if you have a model with low, medium, and high-skilled labor, it could explain why inequality can increase in both an emerging economy and an advanced economy, because medium-skilled work, for example, paralegal services, programming skills, low-grade accounting skills, can move to low-wage economies, but not to benefit those who are earning low wages in those economies, to benefit the medium-level skills in those economies, who then open up a gap. Here, in an advanced economy, we lose those skills. The middle of the labor market gets squeezed. We still have low-skilled jobs because they're location-specific, often services that can't be traded, cleaning, catering, etc. And so the middle of the labor market gets squeezed. We end up with driving inequality here, driving inequality in emerging economies. So basically, what you can explain is why trade, working with a golden and cats type model, can drive this inequality. But it's not, by itself, it can't explain what's going on. And in fact, if I were to find a correlation between openness to trade and top incomes growth, you wouldn't find any. It's not the only explanation. And you could show similar correlation. Openness to trade, the more you trade, you don't get more inequality by itself. There's other factors in there, and I think that's important. You can't just blame trade. And actually, it's dangerous, because if you were to start putting barriers to trade, actually it would make the lower income categories worse off, because you would increase the cost, particularly of consumption goods, which would actually make lower income households much worse off. And finally, let me turn to changes in bargaining power as an explanatory factor, because certainly there has been a weakening of organized labor, of trade union power since the 1980s. And that can explain why you get a shift towards capital and away from labor income. But that by itself is a once-and-for-all effect. It can't explain why you suddenly you get a continuing increase in inequality. That would explain why all of a sudden workers that are unionized are able to bargain less, and some of that goes to profit. There's a shift from earnings from labor income to profits, but I can't explain why that should continue over time. So let me summarize where we got to. It's likely that the income distribution and hence inequality in a country is driven by a mix of fundamental forces, and that impinges in a biased or differential way on different tasks and hence skills. Repetitive tasks, some of which previously required a certain lower or medium level of skills and education, can be automated. In addition, increased trade and globalization and the fragmentation of the value chain internationally can explain why those medium-level skills can then be offshored, and that increases inequality in both developed and developing economies. And to some extent, some jobs, locally based services which cannot be traded internationally, as I mentioned, catering, cleaning jobs, then clearly those that rely on manual skills do survive, but of course it helps to exacerbate inequality too. And evolving institutions might also play a role in that, in explaining why the differential has increased, but by itself it cannot explain what the driving force is. Before turning to the policy solutions, that might be open to society, I just want to turn to another factor which shows the potential persistence of inequality across generations, which makes it, I think, more pernicious still. And this is the intergenerational perspective that I mentioned. Miles Korak describes a relationship which has since been dubbed the Great Gatsby curve. He surveyed studies of intergenerational income mobility across countries, and he presents comparable estimates of income mobility across a selected group of countries and against Gini coefficients. He plots income mobility against Gini coefficients. Basically, on the vertical axis, you have, as you go up, you get less intergenerational mobility. So basically, it's actually a measure of immobility. And on this axis, you measure the Gini coefficient. And you see there's a positive relationship. The countries that have the greatest levels of income inequality are also those that exhibit the highest intergenerational persistence in earnings. Now, just to explain what this immobility measure is, it's a measure of persistence of income across generations. It's the amount that a person's earnings is dependent on their parents' earnings. And as I say, the higher that measure, the more of a correlation exists between a person's earnings and their parents' earnings. And that's actually quite striking because it suggests that inequality persists over generations. Now, the channel through which Korak suggests this effect, this Great Gatsby effect, is happening is, in fact, through human capital, again, education. Because if you look at a model of investment in child education by economists like Gary Becker and others, they predict that on average, if you have lower incomes, you'll be able to invest. You can afford to invest less in children's education. So disadvantage fosters disadvantage, and of course, advantage fosters advantage. There's actually a really interesting economic history study, and if you get a chance to read this book, I would encourage you to do it, by someone called Gregory Clark. And he's been looking at he looks at surnames. He looks at surnames across history in countries like the US, like Sweden, and he finds that high-status surnames high-status surnames remain high-status surnames over time. And it's really fascinating. He finds what you might call an intergenerational earning elasticity, a correlation almost, which is as high as 0.75 or 0.8. There's almost a perfect correlation. So doctors beget doctors, lawyers beget lawyers, and vice versa. And even in Sweden, a country that does have less inequality, actually you see those correlations. And I really think that it's interesting to look at how there's a lack of social mobility in the population. Let me skip this because there's also a strong correlation between immobility and in social immobility and the top 1%. Very briefly, I won't go through this because I do want to get to the policy bit. Inequality is bad in itself, right? No doubt about that. There's a moral imperative. But beyond the moral imperative, there's another reason why we should care about inequality, because actually it may feed back onto growth. So, and a number of economists, Joe Stiglitz, Austria, and some of his co-authors have suggested that inequality in turn may cause slower growth. And I won't go into the details of this, but a lot of it is around creating more rent-seeking behavior, more fighting over the pie as opposed to the size of the pie itself, more social instability as a result of greater inequality. So, and finally, I mean, some people have pointed out recently there is even a situation if you're in a recession, if you have high inequality, you could actually get a situation where the recession is exacerbated because, of course, high earners tend to be higher savers. And so in a demand-constrained economy, you might actually have a slowdown in the recovery itself because of the fact that poorer people, incomes are falling, therefore consumption is falling, saving is increasing, and that's not exactly helping the economic recovery. So there's a number of explanations there. So let me actually move to the policy interventions, because I think that's the interesting bit in many respects. What policy interventions are open to us if we really do care about inequality? And there's a number of ways in which one could intervene. Clearly, more progressive taxation has an effect in making inequality better. We've seen that in the Nordic countries. But even there, as I said, inequality has risen recently. And one of the issues is that if the processes driving inequality are inextricably linked to technology, as Goldin and Katz and others have suggested, then actually redistribution by itself through taxes will have a temporary effect, because technology will keep driving against education. And again, as it's not just about taxes. David Bell and his co-authors show that benefits and tax credits can have a greater impact in reducing inequality. In Britain, 12 to 14% in the reduction in inequality recently has been, or attenuation in inequality, has been achieved through benefits, whilst only 4% has been achieved through taxes. And of course, high taxation does have potential disincentive effects. If you push that too high, then you could actually impact negatively on growth. Now, I think the integration of benefits and income taxation, so in-work benefits, which address this really powerful disincentive of work at low incomes, is a really important thing. It's difficult to manage, it's difficult to administer in terms of income tax credits, but it is hugely powerful. That's where some of the highest disincentives to work exist. You know, something thinks the highest marginal rates are the higher end of the income distribution. It's not true. In many countries, because of the loss of benefits when your earnings go up, when you just enter the labor market, that can be a huge issue. So it's important to look at that integration. Labor market interventions like the minimum wage and the living wage, again, this can be really important. It can make a huge difference at that point in the distribution. Of course, because I believe in the golden and cat stories and variants thereof, I do believe that education and investment in public goods through progressive taxation, funded through progressive taxation, can have a really important effect in reducing inequality. But more importantly still, I think investments in early childhood health and education investment might have a fantastic effect. And there's a really interesting study by Anna Iser, because she actually tries to see how different types of public spending may help to reduce this Korak effect, this Great Gatsby effect, this intergenerational inequality. She focuses on spending on childhood education, childhood health, and finds that the spending on these categories of public goods tends to reduce inequality in educational outcomes as measured by PISA, Program for International Student Assessment Scores. In contrast, if you spend more on older generations, then that actually can make inequality worse because it exacerbates the transmission of inequality across generations. So if you really care about the Great Gatsby effect, then you should focus spending on public goods that benefits children. So childcare, health, child health, early years education. And this then leads into debate as to whether we care more or as much as a society about inequality at all points in time, or about the intergenerational transmission of inequality. Other measures which could alleviate that Great Gatsby effect might be reforms to inheritance taxation. Interestingly, I showed you that Italy was one of the countries that had some very high levels of inequality. Italy happens to have one of the most generous inheritance tax regimes in Europe. So in Italy, actually, if you have an estate worth several million euros, and if you have enough heirs, which usually you do in Italy, then you can actually get away, you can shield most of your estate. In the UK, of course, if there's a threshold of 325,000, if you over that threshold, however, you can reduce your inheritance tax bill by giving to charity, giving 10% to charity, which lowers the tax rate to 36% from 40%. We could make it more progressive. We could encourage people to give more to charity. That would be another measure that would reduce that effect. Turning briefly to social capital, and I haven't said much about social capital at all, then I think we could invest in social capital. There's evidence that social capital encourages growth, and I won't say much about this. It would require a lecture in itself. But if you look at social capital and cooperative norms, interpersonal trust, creating spending on housing which creates communities, that could also have a reduction in those inequality, and therefore a positive impact on growth, which I won't be able to go into in detail tonight. So let me draw to a conclusion. Economists are often blamed for confusing matters by introducing lots of models and ideas which pull in different directions and don't provide a firm conclusion. And I hope I haven't done that. Instead, I really hope that what I've provided you with is a balanced message that dealing with inequality requires a bit of thinking, that its immediate causes, i.e. low pay, may not be its fundamental causes. The fundamental causes are technological change, education, and health, particularly in the early years. And also that inequality across generations, as much as the distribution of income at any given period of time, is something which matters because it's a reinforcing effect. And finally, that those inextricable linkages between those forces that drive inequality and those forces that drive growth, understanding those matters if we really don't want to halt economic progress, and that would make it even more difficult to deal with the distributional issues, because the absence of economic growth, as I say, increases rent-seeking behavior. We start fighting over the size of the pie as opposed to the pie itself. So let me leave you with this thought. If we care about inequality, should we not explicitly test each public policy measure against this dimension? If we think that social justice is part of our performance framework as a society, wouldn't it make sense to look at the range of public spending and ask explicitly and indeed analytically whether each measure is regressive or is progressive? To apply an inequality test to public policy measures as part of that national framework, and as I've argued, some of the results might surprise us, even if we wish to believe that every single penny spent on every single public good is progressive. Now, this, of course, takes us into very difficult political terrain. And it's not for economists, it's for society and the elected representatives to make those judgments. But to enable them to make those judgments, I think we need a sound evidence base. And given demographic and current cyclical fiscal pressures, if as a society we really do care about growing inequality as well as economic growth, I would argue that taking an approach which looks not only at a snapshot but at the dynamic effects makes sense. So we shouldn't just focus on the impact of public good measures or public spending at a point in time. We should look at how this is going to impact on future inequality through social mobility. Across the world, many policymakers are rightly concerned about inequality. You're even finding central bankers now talking about inequality, even though they can't do anything about it. It's becoming a bit of a trend. But if we're really serious about economic inequality, then I think we need to design our economic and political institutions and policies with fairness at their heart. Not only to level the playing field for the current generation, I don't think that's enough as a test because of these intergenerational effects, but also, more importantly, for future generations. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Anton. That's quite a performance and full of thought-provoking observations and ideas. I'm sure there'll be a great many questions. Give people a moment to settle down, and then perhaps we'll follow the pattern we've had in the last few seminars. That's to say, try and gather 2 or 3 questions and then allow our speaker the opportunity to address them as a group. And continue in that way. Can I also ask that if you want to ask a question, please just show your hand and I'll try to identify you. But at the beginning of your question, could you identify yourself? And if you think it's appropriate, any affiliation that might be relevant to the question that you're going to put. So who would like to show first? I have one here. Any more straight away? There's a couple at the very back as well, right behind you, and then we'll take these 3, and then I can take the others later. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Thomas Ward. It's easy to think of potential areas of public spending or government policy which are currently under-resourced from the point of view of the issues you're addressing now. What I'd be interested, though, at a time of constrained public expenditure, is whether you can think of any examples of current quite significant public spending which fails to achieve these objectives, where we perhaps think of pulling back slightly in some of those areas.
And then the 2 questions at the back.
Hi, I'm Kenny Richmond from Scottish Enterprise. In the policy options mix, what role do you think creating better businesses could play? So increasing productivity, feeding through to increasing wages.
And just beside you, I think, was the other question. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Muscatelli. It was very good. I'm Nasra Bradley, also from University of Glasgow. My question is, I really relate to what you say about how education impacts inequality, but I'd like to go one step deeper with regard to how innovation and technology plays in it, the role that basically we have had over the last, what Tunzelman says is the 3rd industrial revolution since the 60s. that is the IT revolution that is kicking in, and we've had more of the product rather than the process revolution. And the process revolution involves really a form of sectoral transformation, which means that your skill base has not really adjusted to the new technologies, and therefore that is impacting inequality. And maybe policies focusing on that aspect may be more relevant than just addressing inequality on its own.
Okay, thank you for being nice and brief and giving Anton plenty of time, therefore, to answer or perhaps comment. Answer may be a rather difficult thing with one or two of them.
Well, let me tackle the first one, the first question. Of course, that takes you into political terrain and all that. But I mean, one of the areas I always feel slightly, well, maybe it's not a huge area of expenditure. Of course, we're talking about hundreds of millions of pounds rather than billions. But I mean, one area which I certainly always felt it's not a particularly progressive policy is prescription charges for people who can afford to pay them. Like myself, I always feel very, very guilty when I go into a pharmacist and I find that I'm not being charged. Now that seems to be one that is sort of targeted at a particular segment of the population where it's clearly not going to reduce inequality, nor is it going to improve inequality across generations. The money I save, I can assure you, goes to improve my children. So the Korak effect is very, very strong indeed. But others are more difficult. Others are more difficult because, take free higher education, okay, which is quite a controversial political subject. But it's easy to say, well, middle classes benefit from that. But then you need to look at the dynamic effects, and then you look at a country that does charge for higher education, like the US, where actually it's the fact that they've had spiraling fees is actually impacting on inequality. And you're seeing in England a system that is broken. So it's not quite as simple as that. I suppose that's what I'm saying. I'm saying, look, it's not just the static effects. It's not just saying, well, this clearly benefits the middle classes or the high level incomes, whilst it does, it's not a level playing field. It's about understanding impact on the growth process. So I'm suggesting that each of these policies should be analysed in terms of its dynamic effects, not only its static effects. And sometimes it's a bit more complicated. Policy options by creating businesses and therefore improving wages. Well, absolutely in the sense, and I suppose there's a link between the second and third question. One thing I wasn't really able to tackle in a great deal of detail because of time constraints is that the models of economic growth that Goldin and Katz and others develop actually can be made really interesting if you have complementarities between different levels of skills. So, a lot of us admire, for instance, the German model of technical education alongside academic education, because they believe strongly in an industrialized type, setup that actually is not. You don't just need very high level skills in terms of high level tertiary skills. You also need high level technical skills, and the two are actually complementary. Now, in that sort of model, of course, and that's sort of a variant of the sort of models I was describing, actually you need to develop businesses that call on both of those skills, not simply businesses like financial sector businesses that tend to only pool on very high level skills, so it could have an impact, as you say, on reducing inequality. But it also ties into the final question, which I think again is really important, because I think that as you move into areas of process innovation, exactly those are sorts of areas where it's not just about very high-level skills, it's about the complementarity of those with middle-level technical skills, whereby you need to invest in both in a country in order to reduce inequality. Just don't just invest in high-level university education. You have to invest in both that and also technical education in order to match and have those complementarities. So it leads you to some interesting terrain, I think.
I have one here, Ian Ritchie in the middle, and someone in the front row on my left. Yep. And sorry, yes, I was good to, sorry. Can I, this gentleman here towards the front, he did show first, and then we'll go back to the gentleman 2 rows back. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm David Wilson. I'm Director of Communications at the Scottish Government. So I think I probably would say I agree with your conclusions, both personally and on behalf of the government. Can I just draw out one point, though, which I think is maybe being a little unfair on Professor Piketty in terms of what he would say, because I think he would probably agree with your conclusions as well, because just thinking about what his analysis shows is, I think his story is one of ever-growing inequalities in capital, by which he means wealth.
Yes.
And his story is increasing income inequality begats wealth inequalities, begats more income inequalities. So to some extent, I think the alternatives you presented around the Cat's Golden story model, the superstars explanations, I think they're largely consistent with what he says. But the fundamental point, perhaps, in this is wealth inequalities and the social mobility effects that they generate are potentially an ever-worsening problem that we face in developed capitalist societies, and that's something that requires a policy response, and I think that's very much consistent with what you said. But I think his analysis also turns on its head slightly something which I'd ask you to comment on, is that his modelling, and particularly his emphasis on this, the equation of that we face increasing inequality if the return on wealth, the return from rich people investing their wealth is greater than the returns, the growth rate in the economy, then we're facing this ever increasing inequality. That suggests that in order to address inequalities, we need to raise the growth rate of the economy, which in many ways turns on its head what many people have suggested about inequalities. So how do we address the issues of raising the growth rate in the economy, particularly in a UK setting where the race of education and technology, as you described it, is often very different than it is in the United States?
If we could just go a couple of rows back and then on to Ian and finally down here, and that'll give plenty of material for Anton to work on. Yeah.
Duncan McLennan, University of Glasgow, although if this question doesn't go well, I've got a part-time job at St Andrews. I actually thought Anton's exposition about the importance of human capital was really important in this discussion. It reinforces Krugman's critique of Piketty that it's a theory of change, but without a theory of labour markets and human capital in it. But I also think David Wilson's point is right about the dynamic of this. And what I took out of Piketty was, and because I'm interested in housing markets and housing wealth, the significant shares of increased housing wealth that underpin rising inequalities, particularly in the French data he had, which he made much of, much less so in the UK and in the US, and the UK somewhere in the middle. In other words, it depends, Anton's point, there's no general theory here, it depends on the structural connections and so on that you actually see these things evolving through. Now, if we take the labour market and technology as the drivers of change, I think we haven't talked enough about the housing system and the land market as the reinforcers of the change. We don't live in a two-factor world, it's a three-factor world we live in. And I think quite rightly, Anton highlights the fact that we now see urban agglomerations as big growth drivers. That's where housing supply is least elastic. And we know also that housing demands and outcomes are reinforced by really significant tax expenditures rather than subsidies. In that particular context, I wonder, we often just go on to the innovation and human capital agenda, and that's important. I actually think if you want to address social mobility in Britain at the present time, or rising social immobility, we actually have to do something about inelastic housing supply and the general structure of taxation of housing. If we don't do that, we'll reinforce the difficulties that we're trying to deal with in the productive sector.
Thanks very much. And then Ian?
Yeah, Ian Ritchie, I'm a trustee at the David Hume Institute. I'd like to change the subject to another one, which is equality is obviously, there's two things. There's the poor and the rich, and we've talked about the poor, and it's perfectly easy to understand how the poor stay poor, particularly if the people with degrees from Poland are quite happy to do, basic wage work and very effectively and good good work ethic. The thing that worries me is that these market forces that are obvious at that level don't seem to apply at the top. Why, should a chief executive of a company be paid 50 million when you would think that it'd be better for the company to distribute that 50 million to its customers, or so forth? Or why do experts in things like corporate finance and or legal or accounting advice in the city, why is that so extraordinarily expensive when it's really a fairly basic skill? Why do market forces not drive these prices down? Why do they stay at such outrageous levels?
Good question. Just at the front here, yes, thanks.
I'm Gina Neto, and I'm from Heriot-Watt University. And I wanted to ask, what seems to be occupying politicians across the spectrum in England, not very much in Scotland, after the economy, is immigration. And I think the implications there in terms of widening inequality because of a concern that migrants, particularly from the EU, are driving down wages. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that, on the flow of human capital, because many of these migrants, as I think the last speaker also said, actually quite highly qualified, but willing to take low-skilled jobs. And I just so I wondered what your thoughts were on the flow of migrants, and also the implications of that for whether or not the UK continues to be part of the European Union and to be party to the flow of free capital within the European Union.
Goodness.
This is the trouble with a big topic like inequality. It leads on to yet bigger topics. But Anton, over to you.
Okay, well, first David's point. Yes, I'm afraid I was a bit unfair to parts of Piketty. I mean, if Piketty had been 3 slides, then he wouldn't have had to write a book this thick too. And it's fair enough that, of course, he does talk about inequality in labour income, although he does major a lot on the importance of capital, i.e. wealth. I think the reason why, I suppose my negative reaction, which I suppose has come through this, it was more because I don't like general theories that are that general. And I think it obscures the structural forces behind it, which I think can be potentially dangerous if you do that. I think, yes, of course, in a situation, I think what Piketty has highlighted through his work is the fact that in a low-growth scenario, where that growth has an impact particularly on those who depend on labour income, then clearly if you have reasonable returns from capital, so if you're dependent on financial wealth, then part of the population will do really well and part will do worse. In that sense, of course he's right. My problem is that it doesn't take you much further, although, as you rightly say, I mean, he also talks about labour inequality, labour income inequality. So he's not trying to diminish his work in any way. I think it's a really interesting historical analysis of wealth data, although I know there's been some questions about how he plots. There was an interesting article by Chris Giles, but it's not, not an attempt to knock everything that he says. I suppose the point that I find difficult in Piketty is this prediction that it is all linked to the relationship between the growth rate and the real rate of interest. I don't think that's the case. I think you could have a low growth equilibrium that's very bad for inequality, but you could also have a low growth equilibrium which might not be. It depends on what's happening to technology, human capital accumulation, housing, and I'll come back to Duncan in a moment. That's, I don't like general theories which don't look at the fundamentals, which just look at general trends, and I think that's why I had that reaction. But absolutely, of course, it's a richer story than I've given it credit to. What Duncan is saying is absolutely right. Housing does play a very important part. I gave you the little analysis around financial institutions and network externalities and scarce housing, and therefore you get economies like London evolving over time, and these are issues that you can only tackle if you also tackle housing supply. The alternative to tackling it through housing, not an alternative, a complement to that is, of course, decentralizing policies in terms of trying to drive economic development away from the southeast in the UK, which is, of course, everybody's waking up to. Every political party is now waking up to all of a sudden. Can I say one other thing, which again takes me back to David's point about Piketty? One world in which Piketty's analysis would break down, where growth would suddenly sprout, and yet that would not do anything for inequality, which is why it is so important to look at the fundamentals. Imagine this. This is a typical economist. Imagine the following. Imagine a world in which suddenly financial institutions really rebounded across the US and UK and other financial centres, because all of a sudden we develop a new product that's incredibly attractive across the world. Can't imagine what that is. If I do, I'll make a lot of money. But imagine that happens. The growth rate soars. It'll do nothing for inequality. Do nothing for inequality, because it will not grow jobs. So in the Piketty model, we should suddenly in these countries observe continuing rising inequality, and yet the growth rate will have risen relative to the real rate of interest. So I suppose that's an example of where I would rather focus on the fundamentals. And to me, human capital is at the heart of this. Ian's point, why do we get this? I think it's the scalable model story, and it's crazy, but actually it's incredible how scalable tasks and superstars have taken a hold of. It's not just Amazon and Google and Facebook, but also in services. I suppose it's because I suppose the explanation, the economics explanation, is that in these cases, these are not goods that you purchase continuously. So these are experience goods. If you're buying consultancy, whether it's accountancy services or other consultancy services, you only buy them once. So actually, you tend to go with brand. You tend to go with strong signals, which is who's the best at this? Who's done a job like this before? X. Oh, X costs £200,000 a year. It doesn't matter. X is great. Look what he did there. He may or may not have done a great job, but signals matter quite a lot. Well, there isn't these are not competitive markets. And you have scalable models, because effectively it becomes much easier for these services to be marketable services across the world. And the only way you're going to solve that is by increasing the supply of skills. You're not going to solve that by regulating those markets. Maybe that's another way forward. Immigration. I've written before, so you don't need to search very far to say that I'm in favour of immigration. I used to do some work on migration back in the 1990s, focusing particularly on looking at the impact that, for instance, the United States immigration from Latin America and Mexico had, particularly in states like California and Texas, where, of course, migration effects are very big. There's absolutely no evidence that immigration, even at the lower end in terms of the skills spectrum, has a very negative effect on unemployment amongst those skills. Most of the evidence shows that it tends to enhance growth. So I think the evidence is there. However, if you are worried about low skills immigration, then there's still absolutely no reason to have the sort of policies that we're observing in the UK at the moment, which actually prohibit high skills immigration, which would be productive in terms of raising the growth rate. So whether, if you believed in the Piketty story, you should encourage high skills immigration. That's exactly one of the things that could help to raise the growth rate. I'm aware that I didn't answer David's question on what will increase the growth rate. Well, actually, high level skills immigration would be certainly one thing I would favour as a way of trying to increase G.
Just as a follow-up to one of your answers there, I mean, I don't think I remember seeing China in your collection of countries, but there's a country which has experienced phenomenal growth of the kind you were describing in your earlier answer. Is there any data about inequality in China with its clearly still
there is.
at least socialist, if not communist, governance?
There is, and inequality is rising in China, and which again shows that growth per se is not doesn't necessarily attenuate inequality. In emerging economies, we are seeing rises in inequality. I mean, obviously, with China, there are other effects which are not the standard sort of model which I've described here. There's a large reserve pool of labour which is being absorbed, but now we're beginning to see also, ways in which urban labour markets work versus the rest of the country. But, certainly inequality is rising in China, as is in urban centres particularly.
More questions? And at the front, one in the middle, and then another also in the middle. Is that Laura Dunlop? Right. Okay, Laura number 3. Anne, you're down at the front here, sorry.
You talk quite rightly about the levelling of the playing field and doing so for more than one, just the next, for how many generations. Given the short-termism of political cycles and vote harnessing, how realistic are you that we shall achieve what society needs over what time span?
Thank you for being very brief. And then we have, is it Laura has the microphone at the moment? Ask your question, but there is another one just down in the middle. Could you show your hand again? Yep. Laura.
Right. I'm Laura Dunlop. I'm also a trustee of the Institute. I'm not an economist. I just wanted to ask about childcare. You seemed, when you spoke, to bracket expenditure on childcare with other expenditure on children, which puzzled me slightly because it's not directly expenditure on young people. So I'm interested in hearing perhaps a little more detail as to whether you favour expenditure on childcare as having a directly beneficial effect on addressing inequality.
Thank you. Okay, and then
Paul Brewer from PwC. It's actually almost the same as the first question. I'd be grateful for your comments on a possible 2-word change to the statement on your slide, which is putting long-term in front of fairness, because all the time series data that you showed demonstrates that inequality does not change in steps, it changes in trends, and intergenerational issues need a long-term perspective as well. So do you need some sort of disciplines in designing and measuring policies that force politicians to look beyond the electoral cycle?
thank you.
And the answer, can I answer the first and the third question together? I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think when I talked about a test which tested for the impact on inequality of any public spending decision or major public spending decision, and also the potential effect on growth and inequality long term, it was exactly that. It was an attempt to try and say, well, we look at the moment, we look at economic policies in terms of their potential impact. If you're trying to construct a performance framework for an economy, maybe we should be looking at those impacts. Does it help address the political pressures by itself? No, but it might create some coalition, if you like, around some of the choices, difficult choices that we have to make. I mean, to be honest, I mean, there is, in a democratic society, it's difficult to do anything else to go beyond that without, starting to get undemocratic. I mean, central bank policy has been made independent in a lot of countries because people did not trust politicians to take short-term decisions on interest rates. That's a good example. But it's difficult to do that on public policy because, that would be profoundly anti-democratic. But I think we need to find ways of framing, of understanding the impact of these policies, and that's my final message, in a way that helps politicians to understand them. But I think even more, it's not just about politicians. We elect politicians. It's about us understanding what the impact is so that we then can begin to understand political manifestos and which promises are promises for the long term and which promises are just promises which are very much for the short term. I think that's the burden of the message. I think, it would be beneficial for society to understand these things. I'm afraid I don't have, I wish I had a sort of a way of addressing this point, but you're right, political cycles do make it more difficult. Childcare, that's a very interesting question. I did bracket childcare into it, but I'm not an expert, but what evidence I have seen, there are two potential beneficial effects on childcare. One is that more formal structures around childcare can benefit the child. So more informal childcare is often not particularly beneficial to children. So a more formalized system can actually be beneficial for child education. So that's one. If you're going to have a situation where you have working parents, then that sort of formalized structure can help. The second point is that it's back to this human capital point. with greater childcare, you do have a greater injection into the human capital of the country as a whole because you allow greater female participation. And that, if you do believe that human capital is a major part, you are including greater part of that human capital asset into production, and that should help inequality. So those are the two effects I was thinking of.
I think, although the clock has not yet quite reached 7:30, by the time any further questions were completed, it would be 7:30. So I'm going to bring the proceedings to a close and ask Ray Perman to come to the podium and address you once more. Ray.
I'll be extremely brief. My role is just on your behalf to thank Anton Muscatelli for his presentation and Professor Hector McQueen for chairing a very interesting discussion. On behalf of the David Hume Institute, to thank you all for coming and for such a very lively discussion, and to invite you all to join us for a drink in the foyer afterwards and continue the conversation there. So thank you very much.